technical difficulties last night, so.
It happens.
So, do you want me to start with you guys? How many people are on here? I've never used this before, I'm sorry.
No, no worries. We'll keep track of everybody that's on and do the slides. So go ahead and get started with intros.
Okay, so first I just wanted to introduce myself, the Chinook Center, and People's College for those people who haven't participated. I see Harima is here. I know she was at our last one. And probably some of you have been to the other ones. But so I'm John Christiansen. I'm with Chinook Center. Chinook Center is a nonprofit that we started. Amy is also on the board of Chinook Center. That we started almost a year ago now. The goal was to get a space in Colorado Springs where we could bring organizations like 350 together and other organizations in a community-oriented space where we could share office space, where we could share event space, where we could share meeting space, basically a space where we would all be pitching in a little bit so that we have something more than each of our groups could do individually. So sort of a mutual aid between different groups. We're still working on getting enough money to get a space. So things are really expensive here in Colorado Springs. So if you want to help us out, you can always go to the Chinook Center and donate. Or if you have a space that you would like to just donate, you can always do that. That would be fantastic. If anybody's just sitting on some great space. But basically, Chinook Center would be facilitating all that. We would be the sort of like managers of the space. And people would pay rent to us, and we would sort of like take care of all the stuff that people don't generally want to take care of. Since we don't have that space, we wanted to do something to bring organizations and individuals together that are working on social change, progressive social change in Colorado Springs. So we put together this People's College, which, you know, before this whole virus thing was at the downtown library, but it was I think we have 12 or 13 different presentations by different activists and different groups, basically where people just have the opportunity to share their knowledge, their skills, their expertise. Because in Colorado Springs, we do have a lot of knowledge, skills, and expertise among the social change community, but I feel like, you know, we don't always know what other people know. And so this was a great opportunity to bring people together and learn from one another and basically strengthen our community. Part of why I wanted to do this was because when I was a young activist, I made a lot of dumb mistakes, you know, because mistakes that I could have not made if I'd have just known what other people knew in the past. So this is an attempt to sort of like speed up the learning curve for a lot of people that are interested in social change. So tonight is part one of a two-part series. I believe that's correct, of basically looking at racial justice within organizing. And so this one is, Amy and Stephanie are doing both of them. We hope you'll stick around for both of them. Implicit bias training, basically looking at, you guys will do a little bit better job of introducing your own thing, right? Looking at racial justice and organizing. But so Amy Gray is, like I said, she's a member of the Chinook Board Center, or the Chinook Center Board. And, you know, she's been really helpful putting all this together. Do you want to do your introductions now, or do you want to wait for a couple minutes, Amy?
We can do it on slide 3 for sure.
Slide 3, like, okay. All right, let's get going then. Thank you so much for everybody that came
Thanks,
too, by
John.
the way. I'm also eating my dinner right now, so I might like scoot away momentarily.
No worries. That brings us to our introductions, and I'm going to pass it over to my lovely co-host, Stephanie, to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Bowman, and I am with Mothers Out Front. And I am your local climate justice organizer. I work in both Colorado Springs and Pueblo. A little bit more about myself. I am a military spouse. I've moved all over the country, and each rural state that I was forced to live, I worked for some candidate who was running around progressive politics. So some people refer to me as a battleground state grasshopper because I would always be put in rural turf and had to organize it. So here we are 15 years later, and I decided to make Colorado Springs my home. And the environmental justice, being from Kansas City, has always been a major issue for me. But I often have found that being the only person of color in certain spaces, it can be very harmful to exist and to like just be a healthy person. And I often found myself creating spaces and curriculum around bridging this conversation between folks who really want to be allies, but what we really need are more accomplices. So yeah, that's just a little bit about me. And I'll pass it back to Amy.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Amy, and I am currently the volunteer coordinator at 350 Colorado and the national mobilization organizer for Stop the Money Pipeline. And a little bit about me is I have been doing this work for quite some time now. I ended up in Standing Rock with some of my relatives, and I decided to make this a career rather than something that I just did on the side of my other job. I used to be a social worker, and I was in domestic violence and sexual assault counseling, and then made this my full-time job because it's my passion to educate and to mobilize and to empower our communities to make change locally. So I'm really excited to be here tonight with everybody. And also I'm a mentor at International Indigenous Youth Council. So that's my other hat. And then I'm gonna pass it back to Stephanie.
All right, so we're just going to kind of start with a question. Why is anti-oppression important in the climate justice movement? I've done a series of these same implicit bias trainings, and some of the feedback that we had was it's about taking responsibility for equalizing power and for creating a space where all are encouraged to actively engage, listen, speak, and act with respect. It's about learning about the histories and the struggles of impacted communities and other groups as told by them. It's working in solidarity with communities directly impacted by corporate power. And then it's prioritizing and building our relationships with impacted communities and a broad base of constituents across social, economic, and political boundaries. By becoming better allies, it's to build broad-based movement for environmental, social, and economic justice. Next slide. Amy, it's to you. Or do you want me to do this part?
Oh, I didn't realize I was muted. I'm so sorry. My kids are home, so the background noise I was muting while I wasn't talking. The objectives of tonight are to really give a critical analysis about how racism and oppression appears in nonprofits and the environmental movement. This is a very big one that we work as a movement to address. So tonight we'll be introducing implicit biases and discussing the science of it, sharing some examples and practicing some strategies. It is to inform, acknowledge, develop skills and abilities in people to take leadership roles individually and together in challenging racism and other inequities. And this is our agenda for tonight. We've gone through a couple of these things already. We're gonna go through some breathing norms, some meeting norms, breathing, a little icebreaker, what is implicit bias, prejudice, stereotypes, assumptions, self-reflection, and we're gonna pop a little homework to you guys for next week. and then we will close out.
All right, so our agenda, just briefly, we've already done the welcome, objective, agenda, meeting norms, we're in the agenda. Oh, I'm in the wrong slide, sorry. All right, so our meeting norms. Be participatory, step up and step back, unlearn and relearn. Talking about your own bias and even acknowledging and becoming aware of it can be very triggering. And this is a process where we're unlearning things that generationally we have just absorbed. So just like if you need time, turn your camera off. If you need to mute yourself, it's okay. Commit to self-transformation and self-introspection. Ask questions. If you don't feel like you understand something, or if you just feel unsure, feel free to ask questions and put it in the chat. Don't be shy and scared. The point of this is for us to talk and to learn a little bit more about ourselves and how we exist in this space. Intent over impact. No, that's in the wrong. Impact over intent. And that's more so often we may say things and we don't intend for them to harm other people. But part of this conversation is to allow people of color and marginalized folks to identify triggers with you so that you can refrain from using them, so that you can be more intentional. So derogatory and trolling will not be tolerated. Be aware of your language, or just simply ask. Call out and gently call in. Don't forget to mute yourself. I know we're all getting used to this virtual life, but please, I had a training earlier and I heard someone in the restroom. So yes, mute yourself. Meet people where they are, and what can we imagine to be different and be different. Lead with love and commit to healing. All right, so we're going to move into the icebreaker. And so you can put this in the chat, or if you just want to share briefly, you can. But I just want you to think about, what is your favorite color to wear? Like if we could go somewhere and you were to get, really dressed up, and you had to pick that color that just makes you look wonderful, what would that color be? Like, what is that favorite color? And then as you're thinking about that, what color do you despise? You're like, oh, if someone gave that to you as a gift, you would be very upset. And feel free to share.
Okay, I'll jump in. I love teal. I love teal. Just love it, love it, love it. Kind of have that color in my nails even. The color that I know it looks horrible on me is gold. I tried on a gold colored outfit one time. Oh, hideous. Yep, didn't work. Okay, I'm done.
This is Liz, and I love purple, and I don't like orange. Somehow my coloring goes along with purple, and it doesn't go along with orange.
I'm seeing other comments in the chat too. We've got navy blue, red is a favorite. Can't stand yellow, despise green. Somebody else's green is their favorite color. Black, despise pink. Earthy greens. Wide range.
Yes, it is a very wide range. And so when you think about those colors that you really love, you may think of good memories that you've had in those colors. And then often, if you think about maybe colors that you were as a kid and you were bullied in, forever you may hate those colors. And so it's really important when we first think about bias, that even in our fashion selection and what we choose to wear and what makes us happy, we often are biased in those own choices. And it starts off that minute, right? Like, just what color do I love? And every time I put it on, it just starts with that before we even add people and race and oppression into the picture. So it's just really important, especially when you think of like your kids and your grandkids, and maybe a certain color they hate. It's really often interesting to like kind of dive into that conversation and find out like what does the root of that come from? And often it's bias, some sort of bias. All right, next slide. Okay, so when we talk about implicit bias, it refers to those attitudes or those stereotypes that we hold outside of our own conscious awareness. So the important thing that we have to realize is that implicit bias, we should be unconscious of it. Implicit bias does not refer to the things that you know, that you do, that you are aware of, and you conceal or you suppress it, okay? So in the past, if someone has like corrected you and you still continue to do that behavior, you can't say, oh, that's implicit bias. No, because you are conscious, you are aware. You may not have made the changes. So it's important to understand that often in our spaces and how we exist, folks can be implicitly biased, but they can also be explicitly biased, where they are aware and they still choose to act and behave in a way where they are aware of the outcome of their actions. All right, next slide. So this is just a definition of implicit bias. If you have a question, if you disagree, if there's something you would want to add to what you believe is it, I always believe in making working common definitions. But implicit bias is the positive or negative mental attitude towards a person, thing, or group that a person holds at an unconscious level. It operates at a subconscious level. Like in this image, it is below the water. We are not aware that we have them. Now, to our stated beliefs and our attitudes, we can say that we believe in equity, and we can truly believe that we believe in it, but we may behave in ways that are biased and discriminatory, triggered automatically through the rapid association of people, groups, objects, and our attitudes. So when we think of implicit bias, it is everything below the waterline. And when we think of explicit bias, things that we directly end up fighting against and organizing around is everything on top of the water, right? It's like these oppressive forces are explicitly making decisions to do these things. But then there's all of this implicit bias. That's the foundation. All right, next slide, sorry. So the word attitude, when you think about the definition of implicit bias, refers to attitudes or stereotypes. Attitude describes your evaluation of some concept, right? Like a person, place, a thing, an idea. So when we say that our psychological processes are implicit or unconscious, we are simply referring to something operating outside of our conscious awareness. Like bias, the term implicit in and of itself, it isn't a good or bad thing. In fact, as you will learn later in this training, we rely on implicit processes to move through this world. So by definition, implicit bias is nothing more than our evaluations or our beliefs, whether positive or negative, that can exist without us even realizing it. So even if it's true that our biases may be well hidden to us, and they aren't necessarily bad, but why is there value in us talking about it? It's because it impacts how we behave with each other. Next slide. All right, so for example, in the clothing breakout we did in the beginning, you can take these three colors. I could say that I'm biased towards red, or I'm biased against green, or maybe I'm neutral towards yellow. All of these statements could be true. And most people would agree that my preferences to red over yellow or blue doesn't make me a good or a bad person. There isn't any morality necessarily attached to the color of the fabric. They are just simply my preferences. And I probably did nothing to consciously control these preferences myself. But to go back, I shared that I preferred red attitudes can be positive or negative. In this example, my evaluation of red is positive, but my evaluation of pink and polka dot and floral is absolutely negative. So, just some key characteristics of implicit bias. Implicit biases are pervasive. Everyone possesses them. Even people with avowed commitments to impartiality, such as judges. Even ourselves as organizers, as activists, we have our own implicit bias. Implicit and explicit biases are related, but they are not mutually exclusive. And they may even reinforce each other. So the honest part of this activity in this workshop, if we were in person, is the idea that like we often favor our own in-group. We tend to hold implicit biases that favor our own in-group through research has shown that we can still hold implicit biases against our in-group. So we often segment ourselves naturally. And when it comes to implicit bias, unconsciously, because unless you were somewhere where you were constantly in various different segments and exposed to that, you often kind of just favor your own in-group. And so it's important as we're organizing and we want to be intersectional and working across race and class and various groups that we really have to acknowledge our own implicit bias so they can become explicit and then we can work through them and be better. Next slide.
So, oh, there we go. Is that the right one? There we go. Implicit biases are pervasive. Everyone possesses them, even people with avowed commitments to impartiality, such as judges. Implicit and explicit biases are related but distinct mental constructs. They're not mutually exclusive, and they may even reinforce each other. The implicit associations we hold do not necessarily align with our declared beliefs that we put outward, or even reflect stances we would explicitly endorse. We generally tend to hold implicit biases that favor our own in-group, and all this, like she said, the research has shown that we still hold implicit biases against our own in-group. And implicit biases are malleable. Our brains are incredibly complex, and these implicit associations that we have found can be gradually unlearned through a variety of debiasing techniques, and that is why we are all here. And we'll move on to the next one. Implicit bias and racism are related concepts, but they do not have the same meaning. Implicit bias is an unconsciously held set of associations about a particular group. Racism is prejudice against individuals from a specific racial group and can be either explicit or implicit. Implicit biases can lead to implicitly racist behavior, like when a teacher disciplines Black children more harshly than white children, but many individuals harbor implicit biases without ever displaying overt racism. By becoming aware of our own implicit biases and actively resisting them, we can avoid perpetuating harmful racial stereotypes and prejudices. The tactics to address our implicit biases are these four things. Become aware, to become aware of individual perceptions, stereotypes, and their impact on decision-making. To learn about diverse cultures and get to know your colleagues and students and their backgrounds, and to suspend our negative judgments. To listen, and listen in courageous conversations to increase knowledge and address negative perceptions, stereotypes, and attitudes. And then to recognize that diversity is real, dynamic, and legitimate, and there is more than one way to do things. And then implicit biases in the real world. Extensive research has documented the absolutely disturbing effects of implicit racial biases in a variety of realms, ranging from classrooms to courtrooms to hospitals. So consider these examples. A 2012 study used identical case vignettes to examine how pediatricians' implicit racial attitudes affect treatment for 4 common pediatric conditions. Results indicated that as pediatricians' pro-white implicit biases increased, they were more likely to prescribe painkillers for vignette patients who are white as opposed to Black. This is just one example of how understanding implicit racial biases may help explain differential healthcare treatment, even for youth. And other research explored the connection between criminal sentencing and Afrocentric feature biases, which refers to the generally negative judgments and beliefs that many people hold regarding individuals who possess Afrocentric features, such as dark skin, a white nose, full lips. Researchers found that when controlling for numerous factors, like the seriousness of the primary offense, number of offenses, etc., individuals with the most prominent Afrocentric features received longer sentences than their less Afrocentrically featured counterparts. And this phenomenon was observed interracially in both their Black and white male inmate samples. And this is a really great link that's in here to understanding implicit bias, and this slide deck and the recording will be sent out after the webinar is over, so you can go through some of these great resources. And then this. So this is something that, you know, these are images. These are things that, you know, you look at, and what do you commonly associate these images with? So this is taking a look at, like, what do you, when you think of basketball, what do you think of? Football. What do you think of protesters? This person dancing, these children, jazz music, food. It's everything that we see in our day-to-day world that we associate with certain cultures and certain backgrounds. And then this is a topic for greater discussion, but something definitely to think about. According to the latest research from advocacy group Green 2.0, Mount Everest hasn't moved much, but simply put, NGOs and foundations in the green and environmental space are overwhelmingly white at all levels, especially top leadership. And that's definitely limiting the movement's effectiveness, especially in addressing issues that affect frontline communities. That's kind of plays into the white savior complex. Most large environmental organizations started like in conservation, which left them largely tone deaf to the concerns of communities that live in the shadow of chemical and power plants, fracking sites, people that don't have access to clean water, and live compromised lives due to the impacts and the after effects of industrialization. Green groups traditionally saw those plights as issues for social justice warriors. They also labored under a misconception that communities of color don't care about the environment. But according to the director of Green for All, a 2015 survey done by her organization suggests exactly the opposite. And for those of us that work in the environmental movement and with frontline communities, we absolutely know this to be true. Communities of color overwhelmingly care about the environment more than their white counterparts, but they're willing to pay more for the cost of the energy, and they know that they will save costs later in healthcare and improved quality of life. And at a time when the nation's leadership seeks to gut and abandon all forms of environmental protection, there are very real drawbacks to the fact that mainstream environmentalists and grassroots community activists still operate largely in separate worlds rather than creating a unified front. We aren't keeping up with climate change because the environmental movement is allowing a legacy of implicit bias to constrict its leadership and strategy. It silences the very people who often feel the greatest impact of a warming planet, even though activists of color could make or break success for this work. Your cultural discomfort or concerns about misunderstandings isn't a reason to not hire people of color. It's something for you to suck up or maybe get more therapy about. According to the report, instead, green groups should worry about cultural misunderstandings when they're working in the field. The reality is that this has always been the problem. Green groups regularly parachute into communities. Gordon says in West Oakland is a busy port and rife with respiratory illnesses thanks to fumes from shipping, trucks servicing the area, and highway traffic. But the partnerships aren't always fruitful. The outside organizations seem to have different goals. Miscommunications often arise because green groups and their associates want to come in, collect data, do their thing, and then move on, while the frontline communities are looking for actual meaningful change.
All right, so the next section, we're going to dive into prejudice, stereotypes, and assumptions, and then we're going to do some breakouts. So you can go to the next slide.
Oh, shoot.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, June. You can go to the next slide, Amy. Did it change? Okay, good. All right, so when we talk about prejudice, as you can see here in this illustration, prejudice is referring to internally held biases. These are preconceived opinions and emotions that live inside our heads about individuals or groups, and they can be both positive and negative. Everyone has prejudiced thoughts, even about groups that they belong to. Prejudice is often unconscious, and you aren't always aware of the biases and preconceptions that are influencing you. And so in this example, in the cartoon here, you have the character on the left who's like, Black people are naturally better at sports and physical tasks. And then on the right, it's like people with the name Sheila are usually jerks, right? And so when it comes to our prejudice, it can often be unconscious. Prejudice is an affective feeling towards a person or a group member based on that person's group membership. And so over here on the right, you can see an image kind of just identifying different group memberships. So you see gender, you'll see age, ethnicity, disability, sexuality, religion. And the word is often used to refer to preconceived, usually unfavorable feelings towards people or a person because of one of those memberships. Now, it's important to remember that prejudice is a prejudgment, and it is an assumption made about someone. And often in this work, when having to like calm down team meetings to do conflict resolution, really diving into assumption made about someone and it being a prejudgment is like very important. And it's something before having adequate knowledge to be able to do or to be able to guarantee with accuracy. Next slide.
All right, and that brings us into this slide with these images. And these are some of the things, just look at these images and take it all in and think about that these are things that are said to people. You know, not all Muslims are terrorists. Yes, my hair is real. No, I'm not gonna cut your grass or clean your house. Not all brown people are Mexican. And, you know, and down in the corner, I am not white trash. So these images really play into, you know, the prejudices against, you know, a large group and how these things become implicit biases. All right, and we're gonna pause for a minute for questions. So if anybody has a question, go ahead and put it in the chat or come off mute and ask a question. No questions up until this point? Am I I'm impressed.
I feel your pain. So I have a question, just because I'm, how does implicit bias interact with like pre-existing, like structural inequalities?
You said, how does it interact?
Yeah, like how do they relate to one another? Like how can we think of them together?
I would say that iceberg picture in the beginning is the best way for me to kind of visualize it. It's because I can fight with you to value my life enough to not pollute my community. But if you unconsciously don't value people who have my skin tone, I need to go to that personally, because that is the root of your ability to harm where I live, to make it okay because you view me as less than human. So often these unconscious biases to me are like the foundation, because I'm fighting for legislation to get you to value me more. But if the root cause of you passing this legislation is you value me less, we really need to discuss where did that come from, right? And is that really equitable? And so that is what has consistently brought me to this issue of implicit bias, is because even allies in this space will have the same unconscious bias that the entities that I'm fighting oppression against. And it's like this weird intersection where it's like, man, my allies kind of say these same microaggression, behavioral tactics that the same entities I'm trying to fight against are using. And it's like this overlap of like white supremacy, colonialism, but also just this value and association to certain groups of people deserving certain type of treatment. And because of our history, some folks have been able to live in a bubble and it be unconscious. So did I answer that?
Any other questions or comments? Otherwise, we'll move on. Awesome. And there will be space at the end. Yep, go ahead.
A comment that I heard in a group of peacemakers, and one of the people said that it's when you have real relationships with people that the rapport and the relationships can deepen, and it goes beyond surface things. And that struck with me, and that seems like it's my experience, that when I have those personal relationships, it overrides sometimes my implicit biases.
Awesome. Thank you, Liz. All right. So, what is a stereotype? Stereotypes are categories of objects or people. Between stereotypes, objects or people, and as different to each other as possible. Within stereotypes, objects or people are as similar to each other as possible. What is a stereotype's structure? So you start up here at the top with stereotype, and then there's the standardized images or the concept. And then it either influences it goes to influence people's perceptions, this stereotype, or it's held by a group or given culture. And then it goes down into on influencing, it's an expression of, and that's why it's in quotations, our values and beliefs. And Stephanie and I like to think of those, as she so eloquently put it, as American. And that goes into, into the function, why it's there, like what is the end game. And if it's held by a group or a given culture, it's more about uniformity, and it's an ordering process, and that's its function.
And so when Amy and I were talking about this, oh wait, can you go back really quick?
Oh, yep.
When we were talking about this, we were thinking about like a real life lived example we're having right now. And so like with COVID-19, we're witnessing an actual shift of narrative from our president, where he literally wants to call it a Chinese disease. And so when we think about where that fits in this structure, we would see that it would put this into the right, where the whole point of calling it that is to influence people's perception, right? And it is based on an expression of our values and beliefs, with him reframing who our is. And so often when we look at stereotypes, we kind of view them as like, oh, they're all blanketed, but their intent and their purpose and why they're created is uniquely different. And this is just a really great graphic that as you're trying to like dissect and create counter narrative, like, okay, is this meant to just be held by a certain group or a given culture and like impact their class and their power in the world, which would be to the left? Or is this more so to influence other people's perception of that subgroup and do this shaming of like otherism, right? So it's just really important as we like do this shifting of narrative and we dissect what's currently going on, that that's just a real life example, so.
And so the effects of stereotypes, and there's attributional ambiguity, self-fulfilling prophecies, self-stereotyping, and a stereotype threat. And the first one is talking about the uncertainty of stereotyped individuals to interpret the cause of others' behavior towards them, positive or negative, to give a group or individual merit. A self-fulfilling prophecy, behavior in which one's inaccurate expectations about a person's behavior prompt stereotype consistent behavior. So we condition ourselves to act in this way because there's that societal stereotype about what our behavior and how we should act. And this happens in green spaces, in leftist circles, all of these things in every group. There's the self-fulfilling prophecy. And then the self-stereotyping. And that affects a person's evaluations of their own abilities and their own self-esteem and their self-worth. And it can affect them greatly. And then the last one is the threat. And that's when people are aware of a negative stereotype about their social group. And then they experience anxiety that they might conform to that stereotype, and it undermines their performance. It can be hard to do well in school. It can be hard to do well at work. In organizing spaces, you're expected to act a certain way. And if you don't, then you feel like you're not doing the right thing. And so it undermines your whole performance in that space. And then, let's go too far ahead. How did that? And the formation of stereotypes, there's socialization and upbringing, and stereotypes can be absorbed at any age, very young kids to older adults, and they're usually acquired in early childhood under the influence of the adults around you. There's intergroup relationships, and these stereotypes are shared because group members they're motivated to behave in certain ways. And we all go through that in high school when we try to act like the circle that's around us. Like, that's a good example of that. And then it's genetic as well. Evolutionary psychologists believe that xenophobia has genetic roots, and so that people will respond positively to similar people and negatively to genetically different people. And it's with the implication that only those who belong to the race which holds power are capable of being racist. Therefore, since white people occupy the majority of leadership roles in public institutions, then only white people can be racist. And that brings us to this image. And which one, like the cartoon is which one is the mascot. And this is taking a minute to reflect on other cultures that are not your costume and are not your mascots, and to recognize that it is how harmful it is, especially to Indigenous communities. You know, the tomahawk chop at the Super Bowl, and dressing up in a war bonnet, or wearing it for Halloween. These things are extremely disrespectful, and I just saw a video yesterday on Twitter from one of the right-wing mouthpieces, and she was dressed up in an Indigenous costume and was wearing a war bonnet, and she was disparaging that Indian Health was getting help from the government during the coronavirus, and she was dancing around, throwing money, kissing money, and doing some verbal singing that was completely inappropriate and pervasive in our society towards Indigenous communities.
So then that brings us to assume or presume. And so often when I am doing conflict resolutions between different teams, I often find that getting a group understanding of the difference between assume and presume, and to use those words specifically in correcting behavior, is very helpful. So assume is to suppose without proof. Assume involves no evidence, and assumptions are less likely to come true. Presume is to make an important guess based on available proof. Presume involves some evidence, and presumptions are less likely to come true. So when you have to correct folks in spaces, I often find it easier to be like, oh, so you made an assumption that this person did not know anything about the topic, and that's why you changed your tone. Into like, oh, well, I'm not calling you racist. I'm not saying that we're not diving into you being prejudiced or not. No, I'm just talking about how you made an assumption, and we should actually be active presumers. We should be behaving in a way that we try to make our decisions based off some proof. And I often find that it's very helpful. And then now we actively continue to use that word, assume or presume, in correcting folks, especially when it comes to coalition building and working across race and class. There's a lot of assumptions that are made in those spaces that are triggers for marginalized folks. And then they tend to remove themselves from the space because naturally we want to call it the behavior as racist and oppressive because we constantly feel oppressed. But we have to, I often find it easier to dive specifically into the language of what you said and the assumption that you made, because then that goes back to that root of being biased. All right, so how many of you have seen Black Panther? Okay. So in the slide, we just have a little snippet of a scene of Black Panther. It's a scene where he wakes up, he doesn't know where he is, he's asking a lot of questions about the technology, how do you have this, where am I? And there were a lot of back-to-back assumptions that was being made in his questioning. And I often find that when we deal with that, we tend to respond in a very direct and aggressive way. And so here, she said, don't scare me like that colonizer. She, not only did she tie him consistently making assumptions to that being a part of like a colonizer complex, where you make assumptions about a group of people that you do not understand how they live in their existence. And then you just make decisions on humanity based off that. And so for me, whenever I go through these trainings, I really find it helpful to like really lift that up, is that there is an intersection between colonizers and folks who make assumptions about marginalized people. And when it comes to bias, is if you are descendants from folks who are colonizers, you have been shared stories and been told things that have been layered in bias. And it shows up in the decisions that you make and how you interact with people. All right, next slide. So we can open this up. You can put it in the chat box, or if you just want to share. But what are some assumptions we have about another race?
I'll break the ice. I'll go first. I'll put mine in. Anyone want to jump off mute? Don't be shy.
Stephanie, are you asking about kind of pervasive societal assumptions, not necessarily personally held assumptions, I assume?
It could be either or. It's more so about what assumptions we have about another race. Okay. So it could be either or. I mean, personal is better because this is supposed to be us focusing on our own implicit bias.
I see.
But it's whatever you're comfortable with.
For people that aren't looking at the chat, Mia put in the chat that people assume that she doesn't speak English, and that she says that I am from another country and couldn't possibly be from the United States or Colorado. And that's very real. Anyone else? Rachel put in the chat that this is kind of a difficult question. Can't think of any assumptions I would make about a whole race, but suggested that maybe that Spanish speaking people know how to work hard. That is definitely one. And thank you for being so brave and being able to voice that. It's hard to have these conversations, and it's hard to talk about your own implicit biases, but that's how we unpack our implicit biases. So verbalizing it, and this is a very safe space. There is absolutely, we're here with the best of love and intentions. So don't be shy, is what we're saying.
And if for you, it's like you don't want to share a specific implicit bias or assumption. Before, when I had to facilitate this, I had to ask the question, is there an assumption your grandparents or your elders made about other races that you observed growing up? It doesn't mean that you necessarily absorbed it, but I find we tend to have more examples that way because we're like, huh, what did you say, Grandpa? So just thinking about like, what assumptions do you know that your elders had about other races?
This is good and good in the chat. And then I see Mariah on Stack.
Okay, so it looks like for those of you that can't read the chat, not that it's not a personal assumption, but coworkers of mine often African American believes African Americans and Latinos don't tip their servers properly. That's real.
Sorry.
And then go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, sorry, I dropped my phone at like the worst time.
Oh.
I think something I know I'm definitely guilty of is kind of when I'm talking about social justice issues, I tend to expect like a person of color to care about them. So it's like if I'm talking about like when I did work for like on like immigrant justice, like yeah, especially when we were talking to people who you know maybe looked Latino or something, and I just kind of had this expectation that you know they could maybe like they would care or understand about those issues, but that definitely wasn't always the case. So I think that's definitely something like just expecting people to care about certain things because of the color of their skin is definitely an assumption that I've been guilty of.
Yeah, that's a very real one. I would say I've been guilty of that one too. Okay, so Jonathan shared an example of one is that Asians are disciplined. I remember my grandparents, it would be like good in math. It's like, oh, you know, you're struggling in math class, go, you know. Dana shared 10% instead of the standard 18%.
Well, I think that related to the comment above about tipping.
Okay, two-part. All right, thank you. Yes, my ancestors always warned us about white people. Yes. I assume that English is understood by everyone, being open about many people I know who didn't speak English, but they understood more than letting on. You can't trust white people. Grandparents, definitely. My grandmother said we should marry people with white features so our children would be prettier. Yeah, that's a real one. And also it's like a survival mechanism and tactic, which we do get into in another series of trainings I do on internal racism and how internally and generationally oppressed people have been impacted by statements like that, and how it impacts our ability to navigate in this world. So that's a very real one. And then Dana, returning to the tipping at restaurants. All right, thank you for everyone for being brave. I know it's like a hard question, but we kind of have to think about that because although we don't want to become our parents and our grandparents and our elders, we all know those moments where we slip up and we go back to something that we subconsciously stored that we heard, and we're like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe I said or did or behaved in that manner. And that is like that unconscious behavior. So part of us asking these tough questions, you know, after this is over, to kind of mill about like, man, there were a lot of things, assumptions grandma made about people that I still kind of actively live and navigate with. And it doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong, but part of the process is us becoming aware. All right, next slide. And so if someone would want to read this quote.
Anybody want to volunteer?
I'll read.
Go ahead.
At the risk of seeming ridiculous, let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love. We must strive every day so that this love of living humanity will be transformed into actual deeds, into acts that serve as examples, as a moving force. That's Che Guevara. Did I mispronounce that name?
Yes, it's Guevara.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so now this is the part where we're just going to do some self-reflection. It's important to think about your lived experiences. What are people's first assumptions of you when they first meet or interact with you? And then as you think about that, think about what's the truth about who you are? And why is that difference important? And so by us reflecting on our lived experiences and identifying the differences between when people make assumptions and not presumptions is very healing. Because often we blame ourselves for how people perceive us. And it's important when we think about self-reflection is that these assumptions inherently are things that generally we can't control. These are based on someone else's biases or they're making assumption on us. So us doing blaming isn't helpful for our mental health. So that's why focusing on what is the truth about those assumptions that they make and identifying what isn't. And then moving forward, this should allow you to see and catch yourself more often when you assume. And if you, okay, yep, perfect, thank you. All right, so now this is a group activity. Do you want to break out in groups, Amy, or do you just want to share this all right here?
We have such a small group tonight. I feel like we can do it, share right here.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So this is a little bit more, this is a tougher question than the last question. So what are some assumptions made about your own race? So I can start. I identify as Black. I would say assumptions made about my race are that they're lazy, that we don't necessarily have good work ethic. We want handouts, according to our president. Yeah, those are definitely some of the, oh, we're angry, Black women specifically, just very angry. Yeah, I could continue to go on, but I'll just leave it there.
Does someone else? Hedima, go ahead. I see your hand first.
Yes, as far as Hispanics, we work hard, but we also party hard. And one of the problems that we have is that quite often our focus is so much into the partying that like we'll spend years of savings in a quinceañera, a party once one time when you turn 15, and they don't have any retirement money. They don't, they're living paycheck to paycheck. So it's kind of counter to what's really good for us.
Yeah, this is Barbara. Are you able to hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know how to make potato salad. I do use mayonnaise, Amy. I do.
That's what I was going to say.
Thank you, Barbara.
There's never a raisin in there, though. I don't know where them raisins came from.
Stop with the raisins.
Do not know.
And then I see in the chat from Mia, as a Latina, we are uneducated, have many children, illegally immigrated here. We are passionate, AKA hypersexualized. Very real. And Marnice joined us this evening. And in the chat, as a Black woman, we are all unmarried, lazy, know how to dance, know how to cook, only eat soul food, and know how to play basketball. Mariah, I've dealt with more assumptions as a redhead than a white woman. I bet. I'll share one. One about mine is that we're always late because we're on Indian time and we can't ever get anywhere. There's always too many people in the car. We all wear feathers on our heads. Those are some fun assumptions.
People always assume that white people can't dance.
John clearly can.
But what if it is true, John? Sorry.
Just say it's subjective.
Yes.
Does anyone else want to share?
Nice. Very nice. And not at all.
All right. That you come from money. All right, does anyone else have a last minute burning desire to share?
All right, so we'll go to the next one. So the next activity is for you to just think about and share in the chat or out loud. What are some things you are proud of about your own race?
Go ahead, Ima.
We are very family-centered. We care about our families, extended families. You know, it's something that I'm so proud of. When I work with our homeless community, hardly ever is there a Hispanic person needing help because their families have taken care of them, which I don't see in a lot of other communities here in the United States. Very proud of that.
Anyone else? This can be a hard one, but somebody jump in.
Can I say as a person that identifies as white, that it's difficult to even say that, like, oh, I'm proud of the white race whatsoever. I mean, because when you, like, whiteness is itself like this position of power, which is like something that you don't really want to like, oh, I'm really proud that white people colonized the earth, you know? I mean, I think it's interesting because Dana brings up in here, like, you know, Germans or Italians or whatever, you know, but I think thinking about as a white person being proud of the race is difficult.
June, can you mute yourself?
I'm trying to unmute, but okay.
Oh. No, if you're trying to
Sorry, he was just still talking. We couldn't hear both.
John, go ahead.
Oh, that's just really all I was saying. Like, I can say, like, you know, like my, I don't know, my Danish heritage. I don't, maybe I'm proud of something in my Danish heritage. I don't know. But it's hard to just say as a white person that I'm proud of something for being white. But I think, you know, if you want to think about like ethnicity or something, then maybe that's something that white people, you know, white ethnic groups, like I was saying, Dana has on here like Germans and Italians or whatever. But it would be really weird to say that I'm proud of something as a white person rather than as a specific ethnic group.
Yeah, I can.
That makes sense.
No, that makes total sense, and it's easy, you know, with the big generalizing as white. But there are things like the other half of my background is my grandparents came here from Hungary on a boat, and they were running from the revolution, the Hungarian Revolution. And my grandma went back to Hungary after she came here, had my dad, left the kid here, went back, fought in the revolution, defended her homeland, and then came back here and took care of her family. So those there, you can find specific examples in a specific heritage, but as a broad group of white people, that's totally and completely hard to do. And
I wanted to give June a chance because I know that.
June, did you want to unmute yourself and contribute?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes.
Something I'm very proud of are the inventions and the new things. Being of my age, how many things I've lived through and have seen where people of the Black race, they are determined to overturn some of the stereotyping that we hear all the time. I used to go with my grandmother. She would wash people's clothes and cook for them and whatnot. And she would only work for Jewish people. And the older people were so, they were kind to her, the older Jewish people. So now we're talking about the 50s, the 40s and 50s. But their children, as they were adults, but they were not as kind as their, their parents were. Because if she worked for the parent, she would go over and work for the children too. But yeah, I'm proud of, as I grow older, I'm proud of how my grandmother handled it, because she would say things to them that they didn't catch on to. That was really an insult. And even at 10 and 11, I knew it was an insult, but they weren't smart enough to know that she was insulting them. So yeah, I'm sometimes I meet people today that I'm very proud of. They're doing much more than they have to do. And when you hear that we're supposed to be lazy and of our congressional guy in Congressional District 5, Mr. Lamborn, he said we're gullible and had nerve enough to say it out loud. So I'm saying, yeah, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, June.
Thank you, June. Marnice, did you want to share?
Well,
I just heard noise coming from over there. So
no, I was having a moment when she was speaking. I'm like, oh, yeah. Well, as a Black woman, sorry. I'm proud that we are a resilient and resistant people. We're very creative, innovative. We're trendsetters, clearly. Most of us know how to cook. I say 90%. And our food is like awesome. Like, and it's just not one thing. Like, Black people know how to cook and everybody likes food. So I feel like, and I'm proud that Black people, we show up for everybody else, every other culture. So I'm proud.
thank you for that, Marnice. We have in the chat, Hispanics have a wonderful connection to food, usually because of that family aspect. Food is what always brings my family together. Robin shared the same sentiment of being white and feeling weird to be proud of being white. Mia, we have maintained so much of our culture under the force of assimilation, language, food, spirituality.
It might be a weird point out, but my ancestors, the Germans, actually created basketball, and they're in the Basketball Hall of Fame as the Buffalo Germans, having created basketball out of the YMCA camps, like out of the Y as it became years and years ago. So take that, Stereotypes.
Sock it to him, Barbara.
I was gonna say, I definitely like agree with John. Like, it feels weird to be like, yeah, I've never been like, I'm proud to be white, because I feel like in general white people have inflicted like so much misery on the world. But at least personally, because I have like this strange, I feel weird, like weirdly proud because I am a redhead with German heritage. And like knowing that actually like thousands and thousands of redheaded women were actually like killed in Germany for being witches kind of makes me like be like, yeah, I'm one of those survivors, like in a weird way. Because yeah, that was actually a big thing with like a lot of redheads were accused of being witches and killed in Europe. So
And I mean, that could be a whole nother discussion. It's just like what assumptions are made just based on hair color, but that goes more like to evolution of man and how we separate ourselves based on genetic differences. But there definitely are a lot of social assumptions, especially for women with red hair or blonde hair, or afros. So yeah, but thank you for that. Does anyone okay, someone shared in the chat, not a race, but Jews have kept their traditions and language for thousands of years. And Dana said that's not true. Germans can jump, and I'll cross someone over. All right, so we can move on to the next slide.
This German can't jump, but the ancestors could.
And so this next slide here is really like your takeaway. So it's like, how can we fight our own implicit bias? So there's a social psychologist and prejudice expert, Patricia Devine. She has linked implicit bias to a habit. So you know how there's that saying that 22 days makes a habit. So the first thing you have to do is you have to become aware. Becoming aware of the habit and being motivated to change it. So that's why we started with that first question where it's like, what assumptions do you make about other races? We have to be honest with ourselves. Like we can't consistently just, you know, act like we don't behave in that way. And so then after you become aware, then you focus on making concrete positive and focus on your concrete positive and negative factors, not your gut feelings. And that goes to that presume or assume, right? We have to make more decisions based on actual evidence and not our gut feelings. Notice. When we respond to things, we make decisions, or when we behave, it might have been caused by bias or stereotypes. So we have to notice. Then imagine in detail people who violate expected stereotypes in a positive way and practice thinking about these positive examples. And so all of us more than likely have someone that we look up to that is like a counter to a negative stereotype. For me, it's Obama and Michelle, tear. And so often like imagining those individuals and how they violated these expected stereotypes is a great positive way, and for you to start practice thinking that not everyone can be thrown to a category and make assumptions about them. And then the last one is to recall, right? So like you can't unlearn something today, and if you don't revisit it every single day, then I don't expect a month from now that you will be any better and being less biased, to be quite honest. So we actually have to consistently recall, catch ourselves, catch our kids, catch our grandkids, cousins, when they kind of say those things that you're like, that's an assumption. We actually have to recall, and we have to make an effort, and we have to assess and think about all the members of the stereotype groups and the individuals. And we want to recall their individual traits. And so it's really important to go through each of these steps to unlearn this habit, because we all have implicit bias and we need to become more aware to be better advocates. But then if we still choose to continue our behavior, then we are being explicit. So that is kind of the scary part about unpacking it, is once you know, you can't unknow what you know. So, all right, next slide. So right now, many of us are isolated. We're trapped somewhere with people that we love, or maybe we don't, we're questioning if we love them, you know. But the real question is, how do we fight our own implicit bias in a time of crisis? So for me, I'll start off. Before the city went on lockdown, I like went to the grocery store and was getting items and getting things so that I'm like, okay, we have to stay in the house and be okay. And I had to catch myself because I would see like someone who looks like they're 16 and they have like their whole cart completely full and it's like running over and I'm like, what are you doing? Like, do you have a family? I didn't ask that question, but these are the things that are going through my mind and I had to stop myself and I was like, wait a second, they could be getting something for their grandma and their mom and someone else. And often in a time of crisis, we go into survival mode and that's when our implicit bias shows itself the most. And so for me, it's just like trying to view other people in maybe other ways in this time of crisis. So that's how I'm working to fight it, asking myself those internal questions before I react. So does anyone want to share?
May I?
Yes, go ahead.
So one of I realize I have a big bias against old white men. But I'm married to one who's a good guy. So I have to make a conscious point of remembering all the old white guys that I see at our rallies and are protesting with us and are doing good things. So I make a point of that. And then now in this day of COVID-19, I think the most important thing is whatever we do, we act with love. Yep.
Well said. We don't have the Amy doing the hands is great when I see that. To clapping hands.
It's a 350 thing. I can't help it. Like when we're in meetings and we like something, we do the hands.
It is ASL, so it's great.
I echo Herima. I have an implicit bias that's very much the same, and I catch myself saying to my best friend sometimes, like, men are trash, and that's my my own implicit bias that I'm trying to fight in this time because I know better. I know they're not all trash, but when I generalize like that to an entire gender, it can be very hurtful. And that one, I'm trying to fight that too, Herima.
I think a lot of it comes down to trying to understand each other, and something like this in crisis, to fight it really means to pause. You know, the best thing you can do is pause. And when you then get to take that deep breath and approach everything, as you all have already said, you know, great things, taking things a little bit more with time, approach it with kindness.
Thank you for that, Barbara. Rachel shared in the chat, I try to look for the things I have in common with other people when I start to feel judgmental. That's a very good one. But in a time of crisis, like I tried that in my thought process and I was like, man, I wonder if they have the last popsicles. I'm like, man, that's my favorite kind. So like sometimes if it's in common and it's in a moment of crisis, you're like, wait a second, is that the last toilet paper? So I tried it. I did try to find something in common, but it just gave me more anxiety. So I don't know. All right, so if everyone feels like they've shared, we will move on. I think it's to you, Amy.
Yep. Self-reflection is a humbling process. It's essential to find out why you think, say, and do certain things, and then better yourself. And this is when I love this one, because I'm constantly telling myself to like self-crit and to know better, do better. And as an organizer over the last, God, almost, 5 years that I've been doing this professionally, and then before that as just a participant, I have gone, my radical swing went, whew, and because I took the time to self-reflect and to do that work within myself. And so this quote, it speaks to me so much, and I hope that everybody can take this with them and say this to yourself every day that you're doing this work. And then I put in next week's training is Tuesday, April 7th, same time, same place. And next week we're going to be diving into ally versus accomplice, how to show up for frontline communities. And the Zoom links in here, as well as in the Facebook event. We'll send out another email with a reminder. And if you want to bring some friends next week, we won't be sad about that. And then I'll turn it over to Stephanie.
All right, so this is the first part in a two-part series that we're doing here with you all. And so this is some homework. In order to unlearn, guys, we have to do some homework, okay? You just can't leave the training and come back and be like, oh, I'm not biased. No, that's not how it works. So here's some videos. We will send this out afterwards, and you'll be able to access them. We would like for you to click through, watch each one. Each video is pretty much a combination of different folks of various groups talking about why they don't like to talk about racism, kind of like our first breakout question and no one wanted to talk. It's okay, you're not alone. There's tons of folks on these videos who have all the reason as to why they don't want to talk about it. So I'd like for you to click it, do this self-reflection, think about what you have in common and how some of it may really resonate. And then come ready to discuss the difference between an ally and accomplice, because that's really what the next training is going to dive into. And then also in the self-reflection, you need to come back ready to talk about where you are. Some folks who really want to be advocates for marginalized people may acknowledge that they're an ally, and where the wall is that they keep walking into is that of how to be an accomplice. And it's really important for you to have that personal reflection prior to our next training. That way we can really dig deep and talk about what does that look like and how do you really show up? Because we as people of color or as Black people, as Indigenous people, we can tell you how to be a better ally and accomplice, but we can't tell you based on your own interactions with everyone in your life really where you are. So you have to plot yourself on the graph in order for us to be able to talk about what tools, tips, and tactics you need to move yourself to where you want to be. Because everyone just doesn't start off as an accomplice. That's just not how it works. Does anyone have any questions about that? Or we're good? Okay.
Are you going to grade the homework?
No, there's no grade.
Oh, thank God.
There's no grade.
Thank you so much, you guys.
Oh.
Alrighty, so for those of you, I know I want to be cognizant of time, but for those of you that wouldn't mind staying on a few minutes longer, we just want to go over some deltas, some key learnings, some things that we can improve. And you can feel free to just share it in the chat or out loud, and Amy and I will just type it in here. This just helps us to continue to improve these trainings because this is a growing process.
Hey, Stephanie, this your manager. It was great.
Hey, I think you all kept it really up to date with your references towards the language with the Chinese virus, you know, with the recent weird video, you know, of the whoever it was that was dressed up and steal it, you know, the misappropriating the native culture. Yeah, I think that those are great examples. And I think you did a great job. This is very new. I can't even get my camera to work, you know, and I usually know what my laptop does. But I think that I think that it's also tough to work through the silence when you're on these types of things. And you've done a great job with that.
Thank you, Barbara. It's definitely a little difficult. Anyone else?
Yeah, I thought this was great too, guys. I think you guys did a great job, especially considering this is not the most ideal format for doing this, because when you're in person to person, it's so much easier. I would just say the one thing that I would do is just, you know, we are told to do this in class, make us feel uncomfortable longer. I mean, that's just when you're going to get more good stuff, I think, coming out, even though it is really awkward. I hate doing it myself, but I think it's a really great way to get it. You know, it takes people a little bit of time. And I know that it's way harder in this format, but I don't think we're going to, hopefully you wouldn't lose people. But otherwise, I think you guys did way better than we did last night, for example. So thank you again.
That's awesome feedback, because I think going into this, when like we were talking earlier in the week and we were doing our planning and going over the curriculum, it, to us, sometimes we feel like we're making people super uncomfortable through these trainings. So to hear that you want to be more uncomfortable is
uncomfortable is the
goal. Okay.
And anyone that needs help with Zoom logistics in the next week before the next workshop, you guys can Facebook me, hit me up through email, text me, and I am happy to jump on Zoom and teach you some logistics. We can figure out how to get your cameras to work, anything like that. Just let me know and I'm happy to help.
Okay.
All right. And
June, did you want to say something? I saw you went off mute.
Yes. No, I don't want to say anything. I've enjoyed what I've heard. I'll look forward to coming back next week, and I'll be on time. I want to throw this in. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I won't be coming in at CP time. No one caught that. Okay.
I did.
No, we caught it. We caught it.
I don't want to laugh as a
well, well, thank you for that. Does anyone else have anything to share? Because if not, we're here at the end.
We will see all of you next Tuesday.
Same time, same place. Thank you.
Be safe.
Thank you.
Stay healthy.
Yes.
I can't figure out why I don't come through in the picture though. Oh.
Did you load Zoom on your computer?
Yep.